The second instalment took us to a time when the Bible became available to many more in their native tongue. This instalment shows us advancements in translation with a proliferation of versions. John Wycliffe and his team had translated the Bible into English from the Latin Vulgate. Subsequent translators went further back into original languages. The Hebrew Old Testament was still in use in Jewish communities and therefore was readily available throughout Western Europe. The fall of Constantinople in AD 1453 caused many scholars to flee to the West, and they took with them copies of the Greek New Testament when they came into Europe, and these became available for translation. It was Erasmus who compiled and published a Greek New Testament from some of these available sources. There's a relatively small number of Greek texts, but amongst the most reliable. And he published the first printed Greek New Testament in 1516. This became the basis of most subsequent Protestant translations into English until the Revised Version. He also translated the New Testament into Latin from the Greek, and in doing so demonstrated many of the Vulgate flaws. Here is an example of his translation from the Greek into Latin, showing both languages side by side and published in 1518. One of the most significant translators was Tyndale, William Tyndale. He was refused permission to translate in England, so he went to Germany and Belgium. He had to move around a bit to escape persecution and to find a printer who was able to publish his work. His work was cut short by execution. He translated and published the Greek New Testament into English. This came out in 1525, but the printing was interrupted and had to be completed in 1526. He published the Pentateuch in 1530 and Jonah in 1531, and he published a revision of his translation of the New Testament in 1534. He did translate other parts of the Old Testament, but these were not published until after his death and incorporated in other work. Here are some facts about Tyndale. He invented words where they were necessary, and every time you use the word beautiful, you're using one of his inventions. He was master of 8 languages, especially his own, and he was said to speak each like a native. He made time to revise the New Testament translation, and the Jonah translation, which was thought to be lost, was rediscovered at Ickworth near Bury St Edmunds. It was bound in a volume with some other books. He also wrote commentaries, and his work was the foundation for most Protestant translations for very many years. This is the Tyndale Monument. It's a tower built on a hill at North Nibley in Gloucestershire, where Tyndale is thought to have been born. The first complete Bible in English to be published was that of Coverdale, Miles Coverdale, in 1535. He used as much of Tyndale's work as was available, and the gaps he filled in by himself. He was not able to understand and translate fluently from Hebrew and Greek into English, so he resorted to translating from German and Latin into English. So parts of his work are translation of a translation. But at least it was the first complete printed Bible in English and readily available to those who could afford it and those who could read. Here are some facts about the Coverdale Bible. The first complete printed English Bible, the first English Bible with summaries at the heads of chapters, the 1537 edition set forth with the King's most gracious license. Tyndale had been unable to translate and publish in England earlier, only a few years earlier, but now Coverdale's translation was receiving royal approval. and parts are still retained in the Book of Common Prayer. This is a memorial to Miles Coverdale on the outside wall of York Minster. Since I took this photograph, this memorial was stolen and has since been replaced. There were successors to Coverdale's Bible in fairly rapid succession. 1537, Matthew's Bible by John Rogers. He used a pseudonym, and this was set forth with the King's license. Again, his sources were Tyndale and Coverdale, and Matthew's Bible included Tyndale's second revision of the New Testament and parts of the Old Testament not previously published from Joshua through to the Book of Chronicles. 1539, Taverner's Bible, a revision of Matthew's. The Great Bible, again a revision of Matthew's, and you see that Coverdale's involved again. And after a little bit of a gap, the Bishop's Bible in 1568, so called because it was produced by 17 bishops, current and future. It was a revision of the Great Bible. It used other sources of Greek and Hebrew manuscripts. It was never popular. The scholarship amongst its translators was limited, and it was produced in rather a hurry to counter the popularity of the Geneva Bible. We'll have a look at the Geneva Bible now. This was produced from the Hebrew and the Aramaic for the Old Testament and the Greek for the New Testament, taking into account other versions which were then available. Translators then took note of what others had seen and understood in the original languages, and they were not ashamed to learn from them. This translation was part funded by John Bodley, the father of the founder of the Bodleian Library in Oxford. It was produced by religious refugees in Switzerland during the reign of so-called Bloody Mary. While the Bishop's Bible, at which we've looked briefly, was read in churches as being the official Bible, the Geneva Bible became very popular as a household Bible. And here are some interesting points. It was the first complete English Bible translated entirely from original languages. Remember that up to that point, although the New Testament was translated entirely from the Greek, parts of the Old Testament have been translated from the Latin and from the German. The first complete English Bible to be printed in Roman type instead of black letter, which made for a more compact volume, easier to read in poor light. The first English Bible with chapter and verse divisions, very useful when making reference to specific passages, and words not in the original but added to complete the sense in italics as they had been in Whittingham's New Testament. And Whittingham's New Testament was one of the sources for the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible was dedicated to Elizabeth I. In Scotland, every household above a certain income was required to purchase a copy. In June 1580, John Williamson was appointed to visit and search every house and to require sight of their Bible and psalm book, if they have one, to be marked with their own name. Presumably the marking with their own name was to make sure that the children didn't pop out the back and pass it over the fence to the neighbours so that they would pass inspection. Translating was a dangerous occupation at one point. Wycliffe, although he was never tortured or imprisoned during his lifetime, was relegated from a high position at Oxford and ended his life as a rector at Lutterworth. After his death, his bones were dug up and burnt and scattered in the local river. Purvey and Nicholas, who had worked with him and were imprisoned, Tyndale strangled and burned, John Rogers was burned. Cranmer, who'd written the preface to some editions of the Great Bible, he also... The Roman Catholics had thought that if the people must read the Bible in their own tongue, let it be in a version approved by their church. The Vulgate had been approved. In fact, it had been instigated by the church, so it must be good enough as the basis of translation. And so what's known as the Douay Rheims Bible, or the Douay Bible, was translated from the Latin. The Old Testament was translated at Douay and the New Testament in Rheims. So that's the reason for the name of the Bible. And that came out complete in 1610, just a year before the Authorized or King James Version. The first translation included many words of Latin origin. It was revised subsequently and made more like the King James Version. But you'll see that over the years it has been revised a number of times. This takes us up to the time of the Authorized Version, 1611. But we'll leave this to the next instalment. This third instalment has shown us advancements in translation, with a proliferation of versions. The next instalment considers the most widely available and distributed translation, the King James Version or the Authorized Version. Until then, farewell.